All right, it's 7 p.m. It is 7 p.m. We are live on YouTube. We are live on YouTube. It is 7 p.m. Thank you so much for those who show up on Zoom. Since this conversation will take the entire hour, we have to start on time. Thank you for those who are welcome to episode 3. I am one of your hosts, Khadijah Smith. Um, and my other co-host is Sinema Olatunji, will introduce herself a little later. This is episode 3. What happened to the African teachers, warriors without shields, the crisis of the unprotected Black boy? We have a special guest tonight. It is Dr. James Ford, we will fully introduce later on in the show. I can't wait to hear this conversation. It's going to be so amazing. As you know, we are talking about our Black boys, and we are both mothers of Black sons. So we engage in the work in a different way, but we had to have a Black man on here to really, really give us the scope of what is going on as a Black man, as raising sons as well, from that point of view, so we can get well-rounded, because as African-centered people and doing Afro-centered work, we have to have a well-rounded understanding of what's happening with our children. So without further ado, let me introduce myself. My name is Khadijah Smith. I am a 19-year educator in the public, private, and charter school sector. I have been teacher, principal, instructional coach, consultant, and done all the work. I also adjunct at the Howard University, and I am also the associate editor at the the Journal of Negro Education there at Howard University in the education department. We are extremely excited, and without further ado, Sinema Olatunji will introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. As Khadijah said, my name is Sinema Olatunji, and I know it does not look like we have been educators for as long as we have, but I am also a 20-year veteran in education and social work combined. I have worked in various fields of practice, but primarily in the space of child welfare in social work. I currently do regional educational attainment work, and I'm also an adjunct professor. I've taught at the Silverman School of Social Work at Hunter and currently at the University of Illinois. I teach both direct service courses and macro courses. And so we are, as Khadijah said, really excited for tonight's conversation. And we're going to jump right into framing this issue, the issues that are affecting our Black boys.
Yes. As you know, we are both grounded in not only African-centered, but also we are both met in Pan-African schools. So that's how me and Snemet was born into the work. And we met and have been friends since then. So we come from that perspective. Every lens is coming from community, and how we can work together. We always are grateful when we are together in community and to talk about our children, to talk about issues that concern our children, because we know this work is not individual. This work only becomes impactful when we all come together in a unified purpose and goal. We thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate all that you all have come and to learn with us today. As we always leave the chat open you can chat on YouTube or you can chat in Zoom. Anyway, we'll try to address, but like I said, we have a special guest here. Dr. Ford is here, and we can't wait for him to engage with us. So let's just set the framing. I can't wait. I'm so excited. Let's begin. All right. Of course, as you know, let's take it back. African-centered education has always been grounded in community. The community not only raises your child, they also teach your children. So understanding that perspective, you understand why Frederick Douglass said, it is better to raise strong children than to what? Heal broken men. Because we understand that we start from the beginning, if we start from that premise of what it takes and to pour into our children, to pour into our Black boys, they can't be led astray. So as I'm going to take you through what the system trap of what our Black boys, if we're not paying attention as community, if we're not paying attention as the Black family, what can happen to our children. So if by 4th grade, if we read the statistics, 85% are not proficient in reading is a predictor of future academic struggle and risk, increased risk of dropout, right? So I always take it back to the Black family, right? Unconscious Black family can be susceptible to traps, right? Because the community is not synergetically put together and empowered. And also, it's the disunion of what is happening with the Black family. If we are not paying attention, the trap continues and persists. It perpetuates, right? What a mother doesn't know a prenatal and prenatal care, then it then further perpetuates when the child is here. So if I don't know to engage, if I don't know to read to my child, if I don't know those things, I perpetuate the system that was set up for me to be ignorant. So that's why it takes a community. It takes you understanding who to gather, who to take under your wing, who to mentor, what mothers, what families, because we have to come together and understand this as a community. So if my child, if our Black boys do not get what they need by the end of third grade, into in fourth grade, we all know what can happen and what that can do to their self-esteem, what that can do to them feeling like they can be accepted, feeling like they're not school kids, right? Feeling like school is not for them because we haven't engaged and prepared them as a community. Now, don't get me wrong, is the system set up to do what the system is supposed to do? Yes. But a lot of us cannot afford the private school system. A lot of us can't afford or understand how to take our children out of that. But we're going to teach you how to offset that, right? Though the system has a design, we understand and we become more conscious, we can then maneuver, right? That's the job. The job is to maneuver within the system, right? Until we can break it down and set it on fire, right? Because that is the job. Because the system is going to align with what it does. We can't fix the system. We got to burn it down. But until then, until we get to that space, we can maneuver by having these conversations, reading to our children, making sure that they are ready and they're prepared. There are community spaces and that understand what our children need, that are ready and willing to support. But if we don't know that that's what the system is trying to do to our children, we'll keep them in that system, which then brings us to the overrepresentation of our Black boys in special education. Now, I understand that I won't say labels, I would say a diagnosis. There's nothing wrong with a diagnosis. Understand what it is, but you better be more educated on what that diagnosis is so you can ask the questions. You can say if it's correct, is that the correct diagnosis, and what you need to do at home to make sure your child is not susceptible to staying in the system, right? A diagnosis is not permanent. It does not have to be. It could be used as a strategy to get the resources that you can't afford, to get the extra support in schools that are given to students that under a specific diagnosis, but it does not have to be where your child lives, and it shouldn't be. Because once they get to the middle school ages, they now separate the students. And what the dangerous things about separating your child based on diagnosis is that they are all in one space together. And what happens is they feed off one another. And that's not what you want. You don't want your child to now become in a track that doesn't feed them nor give them what they need. I always tell parents, if your child has a diagnosis, if your child is labeled as something, you work twice as hard than the teacher in the building. You have to work twice as hard with giving the skills, filling in the gaps that they need more than the people at the building. Because no one's going to care more about your child than the Black family. No one's going to care more about what your child needs, how they need to be serviced, and what correct positioning they need to be in their school system. Which then, if they don't get that, we now go to school discipline. Because now I'm in a classroom with everybody who does what I do, whatever that may be, whatever those negative behaviors that they're labeled to do. And it's increased. And now, though every child is doing those behaviors because I'm the Black boy, they're now intensified. Right? As I get older, those little playful things that we thought were cute, right, now gets intensified and labeled as misbehaviors, right? And then that's where we come with the makeup of 8% of our public school students account for 25% of suspensions and higher law enforcement referrals. Because now it's not cute. Now they're seen as grown men. Now they're seen as fear factors. Now they're seen as people who are always making trouble. And guess what? That deflates the self-esteem of the Black boy. They look like there's no way they have to come to this building or their parents are going to go to jail. So now I have to come to this building where I don't feel empowered. I don't feel like I can do it, but I have to be here. So I'm going to do the bare minimum, and it's not in excellence. It's not going to get me where I want to be. And when I get to the age where I can drop out, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to do that. Because I always say this, the people on the block never take a day off, right? And if they show me love and that's where I'm getting my love from, and it's not my community, I'm going where I can get the love. Our kids maneuver where they can get the love. It might not look positive, and as adults, we understand that that's not love, but it's where I feel accepted. It's where I can get the encouragement. It's all the things I need to do. So, Sinema, we'll take it further from here.
So thank you for that very powerful framing, right? And it reminds me of when I was a high school English teacher in DC. And so even though Khadijah and I went to school together, we also taught together. So lots of best friends, right? But I remember being in the classroom and realizing that all children wanted to learn, right? And that the things that people have been saying about our children, specifically our Black boys, was not true, right? And so decided to go and get my degree in social work because I realized that there were other systems that were in play that were going to further disempower, disenfranchise our children, right? And she so beautifully explained what we call in education and social work that third grade to prison nexus, right? And so from a statistical perspective, we see that our Black boys are 5 times more likely than white youth to be incarcerated, right? Even when they are committing similar offenses, right? And this is not a disparity that is a reflection of behavior. Let's be very clear, right? It is the systemic bias that is within our justice system. It is clear that children, your brain is not developed until 28 years old, right? And children are going to make mistakes. They are going to be children, right? And so Black boys are more often treated as criminals, right? Their behavior is seen, as criminality, rather than these are children who are in need of support, right? And so their missteps, their mistakes, the things that they should be allowed to do as children, as boys, become criminal records. And these are the things that create those lifelong barriers by way of education, employment, well-being. And then we want to do something that we call in social work blaming the victim. Why can't they just get it together? Why can't they just be upstanding members of society? And we have to be very clear, right? Khadijah said, burn the system down, right? And I know that seems to be, that could be a lot, but it's the truth, right? What is a society that incarcerates its children, right? And so folks are always talking about we have to reimagine our justice systems. There should be no justice system that involves our children, right? Everything that we do with our children should be restorative. Our approach should affirm our Black boys, right? Affirm their humanity, affirm the genius that is within them, that inherent genius that is within them, and allow that to reflect outwardly, right? And so we have to really see it as policies reflecting the belief and the knowing, right? And we have said this before, that every child inherent with them is the skills, gifts, and abilities, the talents to be great, right? To be the kings that they are. And every child deserves that dignity, the chance to develop, right? Not detention, right? And so when our boys are navigating these systems, education systems, the juvenile justice system, or whatever system, child welfare system, right? We often see when a young boy is brought into the child welfare system, they often languish in care and age out, right? So our boys are faring worse in every system that they encounter. And so we're seeing higher rates of suicidality, right, among our Black boys. And so, from, over the recent years, we have seen that the rates of suicide Black boys between the ages of 5 and 12 have nearly doubled, right? That is a crisis of epic proportions. And that is something that we have to really address, right? And this rise reflects just a mix of racism-induced trauma, right, for our Black boys. You talk about, Khadijah and I grew up in New York City in the 90s where young Black men walking down the street, being susceptible to stop and frisk, right? Doing nothing, but merely, you know, being a Black boy walking down the street and having cops stop you and frisk you and accuse you of criminal offenses, right? The stigma that is around mental health, that when young Black boys are experiencing depression, right, anxiety, other types of mental health diagnoses, there's this stigma around them being able to speak up, being able to say that this is how I'm feeling and feel vulnerable around their mental wellness, right? And then the lack of culturally competent care in schools and communities and mental health or behavioral health systems, right? Oftentimes, the therapeutic modalities that are in place for our Black children do not reflect who they are culturally. And then we say we further pathologize their trauma and say, you know, they have conduct disorder, right? Or oppositional defiance disorder, where they are just exhibiting the trauma that they have experienced, whether it is in their family, their community, or the system that they have been thrust into. So this becomes an equity issue, right? We have to prioritize mental health as an equity issue. There is no one size fits all approach, and it has to be an approach that speaks specifically to our young Black men, affirms who they are, their identity as young Black men. So that means investing in culturally competent counselors and social workers, people who affirm them, who look like them, right? Who understand what they are going through, having trauma informed and healing centered educators, right? Because it's one thing for us to help our young people to identify the trauma they've experienced, but then we got to show them what to do with it, right? Okay, you have this anger, you have this anxiety, you have this traumatic event. What then do you do? And then we teach them to heal, right? And then accessible mental health resources that speak to their lived experiences, right? So these are all really important. And then Khadijah touched on this, you know, when we think about adultification bias, right, and perceived aggression of our young men, I immediately think of Tamir Rice, right, who was 12 years old in a park playing with a toy gun, like kids do all the time. And thinking back to the 911 call where he was described as a young Black man, and it took that police officer less than a few seconds to pull the trigger and murder him, right? And so we, you know, research shows that Black boys are perceived as older, less innocent, right? More dangerous than their white counterparts. And this starts as early as 10 years old, right? So this adultification bias leads to harsher discipline in schools. It leads to an increased interaction with law enforcement and that diminished access to empathetic and compassion based support systems, right? So addressing this bias is not optional, right? It is a matter of justice and protection. As a community, the African centered way is to protect our children, right? And so we have to train educators, law enforcement, caregivers to see Black boys as they are, children with potential, with promise, and deserving the care and consideration. So when presented together, these data points tell a really, really powerful story as to what our Black boys are encountering, right? And our Black boys in America face compounded harm across many systems. These systems, whether they're educational, criminal, mental health, they often serve as trauma systems unable to meet the needs of our young men, right? And they are rooted in these racialized perceptions and systemic neglect. And so if we fail our Black boys, we fail our future. We fail they, you know, they don't become and actualize into the young men that we know that they can be, the providers and protectors of our community, right? And so tonight's conversation is really about the people in the field who are doing the work, right? Who are dedicated and devoted to, you know, this work of you know, raising and educating our children. So as we said earlier today, we have Dr. James Ford, who is a friend and colleague of mine. Dr. Ford is an award-winning educator, nonprofit leader, and consultant on issues of equity in education. He is the founding executive director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education, or CREED, a North Carolina-based education nonprofit focused on eliminating racial disparities from the education system within the state from early childhood to post-secondary levels. He is also the principal consultant at Filling the Gap Educational Consultants, which was established in 2016 to offer organizations strategic advisement and facilitate professional learning. Dr. Ford served on the North Carolina State Board of Education from 2018 to 2023, and he is a two-time TEDx speaker, published columnist, and 2014 North Carolina Teacher of the Year. And we are so, so blessed to have you with us tonight. So welcome, welcome, Dr. Ford.
Thank you. Incredibly proud to be here and excited about this platform you created. So I'm honored.
Thank you. So we're going to jump into the first question. Who was James Ford, the boy? And what experiences, both challenging and affirming, have been most influential in shaping James Ford, the man? There's a second part to the question.
Yeah.
How did these experiences affect your personal and professional development? And how did they impact your sense of identity?
Yeah. Great question. I'll try to answer every part of it. So James Ford, the boy, would have gone by Jimmy. Everybody called me Jimmy. James Ford was my dad. That was James Senior. So everybody knew me as Jimmy. Playful, creative, curious, verbal, super verbal. And I would say um at times just disjointed, right? Which is expected, right? It's within developmental range. Um, loved music, loved to argue, loved sports, and a lot of those things they continue to hold true today. When I think about the other part of the question, right, as far as my experiences, some of those things that we identify as assets or qualities within Black boys, um, they also can, depending on the context, be perceived as threats.
Mm.
And so I mentioned being talkative, and my mother still has a lot of my old report cards. She's kind of a amateur historian, and you see the stuff in the comment section that we would often see with boys, right? Like he's capable. I don't know how he's getting his work done because he talks all the time. He's always off task or what have you. Uh, and those were the sorts of experiences that also shaped me as well. I'll add some context. I'm from Northern Illinois, a city called Rockford, 90 miles northwest of Chicago. It is not Chicago. I'm quick to correct people for any number of reasons, but it's not a major metropolis, right? It doesn't have the diversity. Not that Chicago is devoid of racial past or history either, but you have a sizable Black population in Chicago, and pretty much in minority numbers that reflect the nation in Rockford. And so our school district growing up in the 80s was one of those who defied Brown versus Board of Education, and my parents. And when opportunities came to remedy that and offered different educational resources, my parents took advantage and put me in those programs. And so I got bused like a lot of kids did in the 80s from southwest side of town, my side of town, to the east side of town, the white side of town. And so, I think that my safety, my psychological safety, was compromised as a result of that at 5 years old. Because I went from being this bubbly kid who was all the things that I mentioned to suddenly being in an environment where it was clear that it was hostile. And not just my classmates, but I could tell and I could discern early on that the adults whose care I was in didn't care about me. That some of them were liars, some of them wanted to do me harm. All of them, no, but enough to rattle my sense of emotional safety. And that stayed with me for a long time. I would also add that I was a neurodivergent kid. So, by around fifth grade, in the sweeping wave of diagnoses of Black boys as ADHD, I was diagnosed. And listen, I think it's accurate, right? I think it is now. I just think that, I'm not neurotypical, right? Like a lot of Black boys aren't. And they ain't know what to do with that. And so that also, I think, contributed to a really negative identity, academic identity, that had me questioning myself. And so, there's that part of it. Now, I think the counter is what affirmed me. I got to give my parents a lot of credit for working hard to offer a counter narrative, to speaking to me and to try to tell me what they felt I was capable of, and to tell me that, not to try not to internalize the messages that I was being sent from my environment. the thing about it is you can only protect kids, but so much. It wasn't 100%, right? A lot of things got through, but I credit what I was able to retain from my family for allowing me to persist and be the person and the man that I am today.
I want to go into this hostile space. Can you describe what that space is before we get into the next question? Because
Yeah.
I think a lot of our parents believe, right? They're giving us a better opportunity. And it in their, their perceptions are genuine. But what does that look like from your lens in
Yeah.
terms of that space?
So I remember I can still see getting off the bus and being in this
Mm.
environment, seeing all these kids. Like, this is the shoes they had on. I had never seen. Like, he was wearing Reeboks and stuff. I was like, why are these kids wearing British flags on their shoes? Like, I had never seen that. But then also playing in the playground, and there's a made up game called Snap Crackle Pop, where it was like boys would basically, run into you, snap, crackle, pop. And after a while, after trying to play the game, trying to fit in, I realized it was everybody against me. That was the point of the game, as the snap, crackle, and pop me. Um, I was getting called the N word as young as 5 years old. I was five in first grade, the first few months. We had to fight. Somebody called us out our names. It was me and my older sister. We fought. Teachers who would accuse me of doing things that I wasn't doing, without even looking. Um, those sorts of things. I remember the principal. I got in a fight with a kid. I was trying to break up the fight, and he's a white boy, not predictably. And we both got taken because he turned around to punch me when I was trying to break up the fight. I'm trying to be a good Samaritan and whatnot. And we go to the office, and the principal, I ain't gonna name her name, but I remember her name,
Mm.
um, looked me in the face and was like, "Why'd you do that to him? Look at his head. He has a red spot on his head. I don't see a red spot on your head." I looked her in the face and I said, "That's because I'm black." And she almost was like taken aback, like, "Oh, like I didn't think you was that smart to discern that." But like when I talk about lack of safety, that's what I'm talking about. Like
Mm.
being that young and knowing.
Well, then that lends itself to this question.
Yeah.
In what ways have colonial educational systems historically contributed to the criminalization and pathologization? This thing, oh my God, pathologization
Yeah.
of Black boys, and how do we still see these patterns persist today?
Yeah. I mean, I think that education is a chief instrument of colonial colonization. Oftentimes it works in tandem with religion, right? So some of the earliest schools were religious schools. And, one of the quickest ways to dominate folks and to get into their head is to start the process of re-educating them.
Mm.
In colonial America, it was no different. You got to keep in mind that for us to, first of all, even getting any education for us, the school system was not designed. Public school, traditional schools as they find themselves today, that was not designed with us in mind at all. We weren't even supposed to be reading, right? No literacy or numeracy. So by the time that it did come around, and black folks, we fought for it. We fought and we created what's now the traditional public school system. But the model that was deployed was the old model, one that centered white people, normed white people, Protestant, cultural Western European ideas. And so in that was embedded an idea, I think, of white supremacy, but conversely, black inferiority.
Mm.
So everything about us, from our language, right, to the way that we walk and talk, to our interests, the things that were being taught, we were never the center of that. And so I think that the intention was always, and you can look at other groups of people too, right? Native Americans, the Americanization of schools and what have you. It was always to inculcate an idea of racial and cultural inferiority.
Mm.
And we, as black folk, but particularly I think for black boys, since that's the center of the conversation, we internalize that and we see how these things how we're incompatible with
Mm.
what's being taught, how it's being taught. And if you don't have someone in your ear or community or, a family, a village of folks telling you it's a lie to dismiss these things, naturally you're going to internalize that stuff. And so many of our boys do, because so much of the system hasn't changed. It still bears those markings.
Do you think, just really quickly, do you think Black boys now, because I think the generation has changed.
Uh-huh.
Like, I know that the impact hasn't changed, but the way they respond and see things differently. Do you feel like our Black boys now are willing to just be like, yeah, this ain't, are they more, do you feel like they're more able, like they're better equipped to being outspoken about this in their ways, or you think it hasn't changed? It's the same. It's just
I
we're just
think
now
it's
more paying attention.
Yeah, so I think it's a two-part answer. It has changed. I don't think it's better.
Mm,
I think it's not healthy, right? So
Mm.
now, and my son says this kind of stuff all the time. Now the boys are they just crash out, right? So it's like there's a lack of emotional regulation, right? So it presents itself as rebellion. It presents itself as defiance. It presents itself as all these things that y'all listed earlier, right? Which are the codes that are used whenever disciplinary action is taken. But a lot of it is like I think in past generations, and I'm not one of those who disrespects the ancestors, right? Like I'm not my ancestors. Like we've always kind of felt this way, but societally, the punishments were so severe that you couldn't do what some of our boys are doing now. But now we're expressing it, but it's in such a dysregulated way,
mhm.
Mm.
right? There's a lack of emotional regulation because there's a lack of safety. So our nervous systems, as young Black boys, are in fight, flight, or freeze, and we'll fight. You know what I'm saying? Like we'll fight. It ain't as much freezing going on. So I think the response has changed, and I think that's attributable to bottling this stuff up for so long that, like anything else, contents under pressure, it's going to burst.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that answer you provided and your own vulnerability in telling your story. It was
Yeah.
just really, really powerful. Tonight's episode is called Warriors Without Shields, right? And to you, how does this metaphor encapsulate the current crisis facing unprotected Black boys in our education and societal systems? And to you, what does the shield ideally represent?
Yeah. I love the title of tonight's presentation because to me, um, the shield is a metaphor for protection against vulnerability.
Mm,
And we're not, I would say men writ large, but Black boys in particular are not allowed to be vulnerable,
mm,
um, for any number of reasons, right? Because this stuff can get you killed. You know what I mean? Being vulnerable can get you killed. It can get you hurt. And I just want to make this point because I think that as we talk about like Black boys, there might be some who say, "Oh, well, what about Black women?" And I'm absolutely what you would consider to be, like a feminist, right? I would say Black feminist, or maybe a womanist, right? Um, and I understand interlocking systems and intersectionality and how the ways that race and sexism interact and disadvantage Black women. I think we gets lost in the wash sometimes and trying to like break this down and treating it like it's like periodic table. Like, oh well, no, you got +1 for being a man and -1 for being a, Black. Is that every system doesn't operate like that,
mm,
right? Like there are moments actually where being Black and being a man or being male actually further disadvantage you. And I would say one of the examples is like in the space of mental health, which you document, right? Because we're not allowed as a man, you're supposed to be stoic. You're supposed to be put together. You can't be emotional. You can't be weak and all these different things. Well, we're human beings. And so like the lack of whole mind body integration, like that does damage to us,
mhm,
right? And no, so who protects us? So we warriors, we're out here on the battlefield, we're demonstrating these same virtues that we're told men are supposed to have, which if we show aggression, if we show strength, if we show get to on in the athletic realm, we get rewarded for it.
mm,
Right? But if we show those same qualities in civil society, are you a threat? And then on top of that, there's nobody to talk to about it because, well, man, you suck it up, man. Tighten up. You good. So we're especially vulnerable in this environment. And I want like folks to really hear that for Black boys, there is a really unique positionality of how those two things interact and actually disadvantage us in that way. Um, I'm in the process right now, not just educationally, but like my son getting his license, my oldest boy. Man, he's 6'2", 215, man. And I'm talking to him. So I'm not just teaching him how to drive. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not. I'm teaching him how to navigate, this system. I'm having to socialize him, right? Which is the African centered approach, right? It ain't just about, literacy and numeracy. Man, how do you navigate in this space? And I have to balance, allowing him to be himself. And he's very goofy like me, like he's silly and he's boy. I hope he never loses his boyishness. And also, I know that society is not going to perceive him as a boy, going
Mm-hmm.
back to the adultification. And so I'm trying to educate him in a way that protects him and provides those shields, but at the same time provides him the emotional safety to kind of be himself too in a way that he typically does not. That we as black men and boys typically don't get. So it's a difficult balance to strike.
just my son is studying to get his permit, and I can't even imagine what that thought process of they're going to be driving alone and
Mm-hmm.
what now driving the fears of the black parent, knowing that your son is out there,
Hmm.
right? So I, I can't even imagine from a black man standpoint that balancing because we're already on our own thing as black mothers, but
Hmm.
that dynamic must be really heavy. Wow. So, what does the community, both inside and out educational spaces, play in protecting Black boys and ensuring their resilience in face of systemic challenges?
You know, I can only talk about our community. You know what I'm saying? Like our community, the black
Period.
community, African community, man, like we are the first and I think eternal line of defense. Because I don't think you'll ever grow out. First indicates like sequence, you know what I mean? Like it's somebody else. But I think you're the first and eternal line of defense. Um, who else other than the black community, than the village is gonna protect black boys and men? Absolutely nobody. So from helping them nurturing a positive and healthy identity as they grow through those very, important developmental milestones as young children, because they're going to start experiencing some of what we're talking about in as early as pre-K, right? Where they're already being identified and seen as aggressive or being suspended, right? So we don't get a lot of time, you know what I'm saying, to experience the typical developmental milestones. Um, but then on top of that, I feel like this is something that like this is something that we've always done. So pre-colonial, but then even like we retained a lot of this community, cultural wealth, even on this side prior to desegregation. When we were embarking on education, there was a sense of community then, and there was a recognition of a duty to ensure that young black boys were groomed in such a way that they knew how to navigate society, prepared for success, demonstrated the virtues of positive masculinity and manhood, were leaders, and rites of passage programs I think are incredible. I got to give a shout out to Reggie Singleton down here in Charlotte for the Males Place, because what they do to develop young men is precisely the sort of stuff that communities should be doing, wrapping their love in arms and you know holding folks to high standards at the same time. That's our role, and I feel like if I'm being honest here, a critique of this is like we've left black boys out for themselves, man. And you
Mm-hmm.
know why? Because we scared. We scared of black boys. The community scared of black boys. You know what I mean? And that's what nobody really wants to talk about is that, some of what I'm discussing, some of these prejudices and ideas, um, even our own community, even our own elders, and sometimes with good cause, but we scared of black boys.
Mm-hmm.
And what we forget is that we actually have a responsibility to them, whether they are our blood relatives or not. They're part of village, man. Our job is to make sure we stepping in and doing something to help counter the wave of just negative messages and negative treatment that they receive on a regular basis. So that's what I feel like the role of community is. It's our job um, to make them, you know.
So powerful. It's interesting. Recently, my car got broken into here in Charlotte, and they kept sending me a letter around writing a victim statement, and I said, I don't need to do that. But I spoke to the district attorney and I asked her, what are we doing for these young men who were involved in this that's outside of punitive measures,
Mhm.
right? And I said to her, I said, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I love the kids who break in and enter cars that
Mhm.
don't belong to them, and they met the right person, right? And so you've done a lot of work. What I love about tonight's conversation is that all of us at some point were in the trenches, in the classroom, doing the
That's
work,
right.
right? And loved doing that work, working one-on-one with our students and our children, our boys. And so you've done a lot of work around teacher education, right, and
Hmm.
equity. What's been lost, right? So how did African teachers historically function as
Hmm.
spiritual and cultural armor for Black boys? And which of those essential protective elements have been lost in today's educational settings? I just think about it from the time when Khadijah and I were in the classroom, it was like by any means necessary, right?
Hmm.
We would tag team, we would,
Hmm.
you know, have kids and we're, talking to them and we are counseling and mentoring. And sometimes you don't often see that now where it's like, I come and I do my job. But what's been lost in today's educational settings around that?
Yeah, and transparently, what's been lost is the soul or the spirit, right? Like, I don't think so. For me, like a chief critique of Eurocentrism is that it lacks soul,
Mm,
right? It doesn't. You talked about the spiritual dimension, and like they're not getting into that when it comes to the education system, right? So like even like the ancient Kemetic mystery schools and the 360 degrees in knowledge, the liberal arts education was designed to create a well-rounded individual, right? Who was integrated in both, well, all of the dimensions, right? The spirit, the mind, and the body. And that's not, so to say lost is almost kind of interesting because they ain't never been there, for like a Eurocentric model. This is why like everything's allegedly about logic and reason and taking emotions taken out because there's no recognition that like, nah, like that's actually not um how a whole human being operates, right? So there's no regard for the other dimensions of learning or thought. um but to your point, we did have that, right? We did have that in some of these pre-segregation schools, these segregated schools that may have been underfunded. And we didn't know when we was in the classroom, I assume, that we was a part of a tradition of folks who always taught that way, right? Who always were concerned not just with your performance on an exam or what your GPA was, but like, man, are you good? You know what I'm saying? Let's talk. What's going on with you? At the relational aspects of education. Because the truth of the matter is, and I've talked about this, written about this before. I was a late comer to education. I didn't teach till I was 29, but I was always working with youth and so forth. And when a cooperating teacher did an observation of a lesson I taught when I was student teaching, he was like, "Man, yo, you got really good relationships. Like the kids really respect you, man. You really know how to talk to them. Now you just gotta learn how to teach." And he said, "That's not a slight." He's like, "That's actually the way it's supposed to be, because you could know all the content, all the content knowledge. You could have all that stuff down, but if you don't know how to connect on a human level with young people, you don't know who they are, right? If you don't regard like the integration, like I said, of spirit, mind, and body, and that this is a whole human being in front of you, you're not going to be able to effectively communicate with them anywhere, execute against whatever it is you're supposed to be doing according to the curriculum. And so I feel like that art and that science has been lost. We've kind of gone to the very Eurocentric, soulless, robotic notions that these are not full human beings in front of us, right? That these are, I don't know, widgets or something. And consequently, we don't fit into that. Right. And that's why there's such a disparity and disruptions because it's not normed after us. It's not normed after our culture.
I'm gonna go a little bit off script because we're gonna get to these questions. I'm time checking. We're gonna get to them, and it probably feeds into this question. So I'm gonna might tag it on to the end of the question. So from an African centered perspective, what two should give us 2 to 3 key strategies that men should use to protect Black boys' dignity against systemic challenges, and how do you apply these when raising Black sons?
Boy. So I would say one is making I kind of spoke to it a moment ago when I talked
Mhm.
about the concern with the whole individual. But honestly, like a demonstrated mentorship, a demonstrated concern with creating safety. I feel like the boys that I taught and the ways that so I'm gonna go off script here too. So y'all remember like man and Roots, right? Um, where Kunta Kinte left to go out for manhood training, right? And it was based on some actual rites of passage stuff in the Senegambia, right? Where young boys were taken right through manhood training, how to be men. Like that mentorship piece, that's huge, man. Like, how can you like guiding and leading young men and also giving them the space to be vulnerable and to fail and to be able to like be confident? I think that's huge because otherwise, if they don't get it from us, they're gonna be hyper individualistic, which is counter to, the African centered
Mhm.
perspective, right? And furthermore, they're gonna be looking at, their classmates and learning from them, right? And they don't know what they're doing either. You know what I'm saying? And garnering their sense of what it is to be a man, garnering their sense of what it is to be a leader, um, from folks who are themselves misguided. So I think some sort of mentorship, I think is crucial, whether it be formal or informal, as a part of the education piece. But then also like, man, tapping into the creative side. Like we are creative folks, man. And so whatever your pedagogical strategies are, has to has to speak to the 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 musical, creative, performative people that we are, man. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like everything is not going to be expressed in a way that is quote unquote traditional. It can't just be, how you perform on a test. It can't just be, sit and get. Like you're gonna have to tap into the interests of black boys and give them a space to emote, give them a space to express, give them a space to like be an outlet. And those are things that we see, being done. I used to, allow students to do music and stuff and write and battle each other if they wanted to, or, you know, joke, play the dozens, like as a part of my instructional strategy. That might seem wrong, right? To people, they might be like, what you doing that for? That's not in that wasn't in your methods class. But it comes from a recognition of who we are. We're call and response people, man. We're musical people. We're a rhythmic people, and you got to make space for that in how you instruct as well. So those are two, I would say, kind of mentorship, and then like you call it cultural congruency with your pedagogy.
Okay, so I'm going to insert this question in. So
Mhm.
if you had a perfect, we burned up the system,
Yeah.
right? The system is burned. We
Hmm.
can we could get to raise our black boys how we want to raise them.
Hmm.
What does a school look like for them in a day? Like what
Mm.
would they do?
Mm.
Mm.
All right. Yeah. This is off script, but I like this. Um. So first of all, I think there'd be time for contemplation,
Mm,
learning how to master the inward as well as the outward, learning how to enjoy silence. So there'll be time for silence, meditation, however that expresses itself for folks, um, and thinking, right? Like literally just thinking, learning how to be with yourself and learning how to tap into like your own consciousness, figuring out who you are, right? Understand that you're not your thoughts that are racing through your head, but like really teaching them like inner mastery, inner excellence. Um, of course, there'll still be opportunities every day for physicality. For those who are able-bodied to be able to do something, right? That allows them to get up, move around, and at every age, you don't get recess no more when you're in high school, and I just think that that's ridiculous. I think that human beings, people in general, need to get up and move. They need to be active. They need to do something. An opportunity somewhere throughout the day to create, whether it be art, whether it be some engineering feat, right, but to be able to actualize or start the actualization of some dream, right, so that you're not just a recipient, you're also a creator, right, tapping into the creative potential throughout that day. I think that I would teach subjects as less disparate and more together, right? I don't like that science gets taught kind of separate from history and math, and you know what I mean, and literature. There would be ways to blend and integrate all those things so that it makes sense because they're disparate. They're sectioned off, and that's why a lot of times like, yo, well, I got to learn this. I ain't never gonna use this map equation, you know what I mean? But in the context of rise and run doesn't make sense by itself, but in the context of building a house, it does, right? Now all of a sudden, rise and run makes sense. Um, Man, if, to be honest with you, I would also uh I think there'd be a good sex education. I just do, y'all. I mean, come on. Like we're talking about whole body integration, you know what I'm saying? And so learning, you're having a good understanding of your own sexuality, um, how you interact with others and being able to develop a healthy sexuality. Um, well, this day is kind of off the chain right now that you've given me license to structure. Um, and then maybe allow them to engage in some mentorship of younger folks throughout the day. Yeah, I think that would be hard. Political education. Oh, now, see, now I'm going engaging in politics, discussion about politics. Yeah, I got some ideas, but to me, that's education that applies to the world that they live in and the world they're going to enter.
What about the people who, the adults in this school, in this environment, right? Because when you think about traditional rites of passage, oftentimes those folks had to show that they themselves had inculcated those values and were living those values. So what about the message for them?
The message in terms of what I would have them to do or how to be prepared. I mean, I would simply say that yeah, you can't be a master teacher until you've mastered some of these things. And again, doesn't mean you're perfect, but until you right now we just give you a license, which a license doesn't talk anything about your competency. My son will eventually get his license. That don't mean he's gonna be a good driver. Speaks nothing about the quality of driving. This means you have a license to practice. I feel like in order to in that school teach and be a leader, you have to have demonstrated in a way that the community respects and appreciates the ability to model these things and to instruct young people around these things. You yourself have to be an emotionally aware, intelligent, regulated individual. You yourself have to demonstrate a commitment to your community. You have to demonstrate a level of integrity that you are who you say you are. Um, and I feel like that's missing too. So that man is like you can't teach what you don't know. You can't lead where you won't go.
Mm.
you know. And so a lot of us ain't good, right? And so if we ain't good, how we gonna instruct anybody else to be quote unquote good? And so we often leave them out, and I think that would be important in an environment like that.
I think that's good because it's almost like how college does it. Like you're an adjunct. That's one layer. You then have to be supervised to then you move up to assistant professor, right?
Hmm.
Or to full professor. You got to come between a community of folks and
That's
they
true.
look at you to see whether you're ready to take on a full class, right? And I think that's a good act. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, yeah. But with the right values, right? Because academia toxic as
Yeah.
heck, right? Them people crazy.
With your
They ain't
with
good
your
either.
situation,
Yeah,
with you in describe, but
yeah, exactly. We dreaming right now. My bad. I got anchored by
This
the
is
negative. Yeah,
the utopian education
right.
perspective, but just honing in on that word integrity, right?
Mhm.
That
Yeah,
you are who you say you are, and that you are, whether somebody is looking or policing you, you remain the same person, whether or not somebody is there to say that that's what you're doing, right?
right,
So that integrity piece is so critical. When we chatted about this conversation, you brought to my attention the global perspective. So we're going
right.
to end on the global perspective, right? because it's that Sankofa, right?
Yeah,
Piece. African-centered teaching has been lost across the diaspora, right?
absolutely.
And so what do you think has caused this erosion? And, how do we get back? How do we get to where we used to be?
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And again, we go back to colonialism, imperialism, right? But what's happened is that education has primarily been a tool for the production of workers who can contribute to, um, capitalist economies, who can be exploited. So much so that international standards are created by a lot of these same former colonial bodies, and it's really about, how well folks are being educated to enter into, the global financial system. And that can't be the measuring stick for what makes a well-educated individual in Africa. And so I would say that in the US is interesting because in a lot of ways, um, we're helping, I think throughout the diaspora in the West in general, but I think we're helping to, in the spirit of Sankofa, bring folks back to what they know to be true because we've been quote unquote free for longer, right? And so we've had a chance to decolonize. We still got a ways to go in ways that our brothers and sisters on the continent haven't writ large. The school systems over there still bear, I mean, overt markings of a colonial system. They're not learning about themselves. They're not learning about their own history. They're not learning from an African centered perspective, right? Where they're looking at the continent itself as that's the beginning of the timeline, right? And not some other far off continent. And so I think that as we begin to free ourselves and continue to develop this model, we without being imperial, because I think we gotta be careful too, especially African Americans going back over to the continent thinking we got everything to teach and nothing to learn. Um, but going there and beginning to um, invoke this return to some of the I would call new African ideals, right? Because the beauty of it is like Nkrumah and Zikwe, a lot of them cats they left from there and went to HBCUs, right? And their exposure to what was being studied here, right? The exposure to like the Carter G. Woodsons, the J.A. Rogers of the world, they were learning about continental history they weren't learning on the continent. And they took it back, and that's what created the Black Studies, the Black Studies field. So there's a way in which we've been able to assist in pulling the shackles off our mind, and we got a long way to go. You know what I'm saying? Like we got stuff we got to take care of here. I think we could do both, but going and exporting that and making sure that our brothers and sisters on the continent recognize that, man, you don't got to center Europe and everything, right? You can return to your own cultural motifs, that those have value, that your own systems of education that don't look at the traditional grade system or don't look like uh, um, ones that get measured by the TIMS or whatever the international body is, that those things themselves have value, that your ancient religious systems and those things, that those can be a part of what you teach. And I don't, that all schools don't got to be run by a church. You know what I'm saying? So I'm hopeful that that potential is something we can maximize in our lifetime.
That's awesome. Well, we are at the top of the hour. I am just, my heart is full. I just want to thank you for everything that you have done in this space, your commitment to yourself as a Black man in this community, your commitment to your wife, your children, your family, and continuing to, not just advocate, but, empower our children and take responsibility for our children, whether they are your own or not. So thank you so much for, coming and talking to us tonight. And we thank the folks who came on Zoom and the folks who are on YouTube who are watching live. And I know Khadijah has some parting words as well, but thank you for your
I
commitment.
just am filled with gratitude. I appreciate whenever someone is willing to share space with us because it's always spiritually healing above all else. And if you could leave us with a charge for Black boys, and we'll end on
Yeah.
that.
You know what? I appreciate you all so very much for the invitation and those kind words. Um, what I would say is love Black boys unconditionally,
Mm,
without equivocation. Um, love being a Black boy and a Black man, love feels conditional.
mm,
Um, and if I could have had anything, I'm speaking from Lil Jimmy now. If I could have had anything growing up that would have, I think, kept me from making a lot of, mistakes and adopting like maladaptive behaviors, it would be the um, the insistence and the knowledge that I'm loved unconditionally by my community.
mm,
So, um, and operating that as a practice.
mm.
Received.
Thank you all. We appreciate you all joining us and have a very, very good night. Thank you
Good
for the
night.
contributions in the chat. Everybody, we'll see you next month.